Integrated Resource Plan update. And I believe Brad Underwood is going to be doing that.
Thank you, Ms. Tracy. Thank you, Director Green. Well, today I'm very pleased to give a status on the update for our integrated resource planning efforts. As the slide suggests, I'm the Director of Corporate Planning and Analysis, and like to walk you through the efforts of our resource planning so far. Well, the various topics we'll discuss today is we'll provide a brief overview on integrated resource plans, kind of the purpose of the plans, how we prepare them. We do carry some assumptions into those plans, so we'll spend some time discussing those. We created a kind of a sampling of portfolios that we feel have unique attributes that are associated with each of those portfolios, and we'll look at those portfolios in detail. Once we complete the detailed review of the portfolios, we'll look at a stochastic review of all 4 of the portfolios. That stochastic review will really provide us an indication of overall risk that may or may not be associated with each of the portfolios. Once we get through the risk discussion, we'll kind of stack those portfolios up side by side, and we'll do a comparative review on each of those as they relate to each other. Finally, we do have a stakeholder outreach plan that we would like to execute here in the next 30 to 45 days, and then any sort of next steps. So the Integrated Resource Plan is a comprehensive forward-looking decision support tool utilized in evaluating the efficiency of options to serve electrical requirements. Maybe at a more practical level, what that means is you have a number of variables that are going on in your environment. You have a load variable, you have a technology variable, you have a fuel prices variable, and so the effort really focuses around how do we understand each of those variables, how do we aggregate them, and then how do we make the best decision based on how those variables interact. Integrated resource planning is critical as the utility industry and OPPD experiences dynamic change in a compressed amount of time. And IRPs will evolve over time, and they'll be reflective of our changing environment. And they are very directional in nature, maybe now so more than ever as we experience the amount of change that we're experiencing. Part of the purpose of the IRP is to fulfill our contractual commitment to the Western Area Power Administration. So we receive hydroelectric power from WAPA. Part of that power agreement is that we will provide an integrated resource planning, or integrated resource plan. That plan, our intention is to file a 5-year plan with WAPA. As we prepare the plan, there are a number of very distinct, sometimes competing interests that have a healthy amount of tension associated with them. And we've got those itemized here on the slide. The first of those is Strategic Directive 2. And obviously, we have a direction and a goal that we're going to achieve rates at 20% below the regional average. We have reliability directives where we want to maintain an adequate grid as we operate the system on behalf of the ratepayer. There's an environmental stewardship that's present here during this work where we want at least 30% of our retail sales to come from renewable energy sources, and we also want to be compliant with any environmental standards that are in effect. Strategic Directive 9 is the directive to complete this exercise. So periodically, we will assess the district's generation mix, the PPA agreements, as well as the demand-side management for appropriateness. Economic development is our directive that we keep rates low and competitive in order to facilitate growth and economic development in the area and in our service territory. We also are excited to complete a Strategic Directive 13, which is a stakeholder outreach. The way we see that directive in this context is we want to give people an opportunity to comment on the process, to ask questions about the process, to have access to us as we go through the exercise so that we can bring those comments back for management and board's consideration as we progress into the future. Finally, you'll see a Strategic Directive 15 up there for enterprise risk management. We want to make sure that as we go through the effort, we want to stay within the bounds of our current enterprise risk management program. As we prepare the plan, there are a number of inputs that reflect our seemingly constantly changing energy landscape. I've listed 4 of these up here to give you an example. They're fuel costs, power prices, resources cost, and different technology options. On the next slide, you can see the various technologies and resources that we considered as we went through the planning effort. Some of these will look very, very familiar to you from what you may or may not have seen from the Fort Calhoun Station analysis. I will point out bullet point 4 and bullet point 5. We have evaluated new utility grade solar and new wind. The cost inputs that we used during that evaluation were as a result of the competitive request for proposal that the district recently completed. So we feel like we have real good up-to-date information for those components. Some of the various assumptions that we make. The Southwest Power Pool, which is the regional transmission organization that we operate the system in, does impose a reserve margin. That reserve margin is 12%. So at any given point, we have a peak load where that's an energy demand for us, and then we go 12% above it. We have resources 12% above to make sure we can satisfy any increase to our peak load that we may experience. We also told the modeling that we don't want to generate electricity that exceeds 30% above OPPD's retail load. That was put in place to mitigate our market and our operational risk in a sense that we don't want to generate too much energy and we don't want the market exposure associated with that. The third bullet point is North Omaha is maintained in its current state through 2018. So the intent there was we said, hey, if there's an optimization potential here and we want to make a change to North Omaha, please do not suggest that prior to 2018 because we want to have time to understand that and potentially react to it. And finally, the duration of the study was in fact 20 years from 2017 to 2036. Kind of the final set of assumptions that we use is there was a handful of things that we were able to update from the efforts that we went through from the Fort Calhoun Station modeling. We did update market-related inputs, so any sort of newer information that we had regarding fuel prices, regarding kind of generic wind within the SPP solar, and then also costs or estimates that we had for new utility-grade solar and wind that we got as a response from the request for proposal. We did also kind of calibrate our incorporated our site-specific generation estimates, and what we mean by that is we have different technology options at different sites, and so we went through an effort to sort of understand that and make sure that we had the right estimates for site-specific technologies at site-specific locations. And then we did go ahead and update the model that we made the decision, the board made the decision to retain North Omaha 1 through 3 on gas for capacity purposes, as that was a low-cost capacity option from the time we made the decision in June. We also told the model we don't want to entertain anything that does not comply with the Clean Power Plan. So that was a requirement. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the Clean Power Plan, but we did not want to be in a situation where we weren't potentially ready to react to that in a prudent way. As we get out of the assumptions here, we'll get into the sample portfolios that we created. There were 4 of them, and as you can see from the summary slide, the 4 portfolios have some attributes in common, and they have some attributes that are unique. And so, obviously, you can see from the portfolios on the left, going from blue, yellow, orange, and pink. That's how the portfolios will be identified from here on out. We have a percent renewables growth, and then we also have an economic evaluation of our demand-side management program. All 4 of these portfolios also include additional wind resources. And then in the last 2 columns, you get into a solar and battery criteria, and in portfolio yellow, there is a representation from battery, and in portfolio orange, there is a representation for utility-grade solar. So the first of the 4 portfolios is portfolio blue. Like you may have seen on the last slide, there was a constraint that we said we don't want to exceed 50% renewables as a percentage of our retail sales. And then for those of you that are familiar with obviously the Fort Calhoun analysis, this is the portfolio that most closely reflects the rebalanced portfolio that we talked about previously. And so if these 2 look very, very similar, both the rebalanced and portfolio blue, that's the reason why we sort of expected that after the analysis. So there are a handful of suggested changes in the near term from 2017 to 2021 associated with portfolio blue. The first one is you can see itemized in 2017, which is that we reevaluate 46 megawatts of our planned DSM programs. So we have a board resolution that identifies our demand side management program at 300 megawatts. When we went through the optimization process within the modeling, the model identified 46 megawatts that were identified as uneconomic. That said, you should probably go back and take another look at those 46 megawatts. The reason those 46 megawatts were identified as uneconomic is if you think back to the end of 2013, early 2014, when we did the AEG study with demand side management, since then, capacity costs have fallen considerably. And so that's effectively what's pushing these things into uneconomic space as opposed to previously when they were more economic. In 2018, you see the entrance of potentially of 160 megawatts of wind. And in 2020, you see 266 megawatts of wind. So just to kind of highlight that similarity between portfolio blue and the rebalanced portfolio, that was approximately additional 400 megawatts of energy, and you see that here.
And Brad, the 46 megawatts, the revaluation is really around what class of customer?
Yeah, thank you, President Burke. It is business direct load control, or some people may call it business curtailable. So it is not a part of residential. Those programs would continue in full force and effect. Some additional attributes of Portfolio Blue, you can see the net present value cost is $5.199 billion. It's important for us to understand that if you recall, the duration of the study was 20 years. So this is the net cost to operate this entire portfolio over 20 years. So make sure we think about it correctly from a duration perspective. And then on an emissions perspective, you can see that there is a significant and meaningful drop in emissions. That data is comparative from the end of 2015 actuals to kind of a midpoint in the 20-year period. We picked 2025 because it was a clean 10 years from 2015 to 2025. So we're pleased to see potentially that drop in emissions associated with this portfolio. So a quick look at energy sources. So here's a graph of our different generating sources. You can see in the bottom left, there's the nuclear one. We would not expect to receive nuclear generation in 2017, and that's reflected here. You also see the black vertical lines, which encapsulates the 5-year period. And probably the story here that we found most interesting was if you start back in 2010, 2011, you see kind of this sliver of renewables, and then as you progress more into 14, 15, and 16, that slice grows. And then as you go into 17 and 18, you've got the inclusion of Grand Prairie, to Director McGuire's point earlier. And then hypothetically in this portfolio, you'd have more wind in 2018 and 2020. So we really see the presence of renewables grow both before the 5-year plan study and within the current 5-year plan study. The second portfolio maintains the constraint of not to exceed 50% renewables relative to retail sales, and it also includes a 10 megawatt battery. So you can see here that the same conclusion is made on the 46 megawatts of demand side management program. Very similar suggestion to Portfolio Blue, where 160 megawatts of wind would be incorporated in 2018. And then in 2020, you see that same 266 megawatts of wind. And then we placed the battery in this year partly because it was our lowest. We had adequate capacity, but it was our lowest capacity year. So it just made sense to incorporate that battery at that point. From a cost perspective, $5.2 billion over a 20-year period. So if you're kind of doing the math in your head relative to yellow, it's a small uptick. And then again, you see a meaningful reductions in emissions, which we would expect with the inclusion of this much wind, and with the portfolio changes that we've made. So similar graph to Portfolio Blue, you can see this is actually pretty much the exact same data. What you don't see here is a battery. That's not considered a traditional fuel source, but that is the only difference from blue to yellow. So our third portfolio, this is the last one that maintains the constraint of 50% renewables relative to retail sales. It does include 100 megawatts of utility grade solar. And so if you look at the 5-year proposed changes, we see the 46 megawatts of demand side management, which we would expect to see at this point. Very similar recommendation in 2018 for 160 megawatts of wind. And then in 2020, what happens is, if you recall, that previous recommendation was 266 megawatts of wind. Basically, 100 of wind is displaced with 100 of solar. Another climb in our NPV cost, and then again, a fairly consistent reduction in emissions. Here's what that looks like from a fuel sources or an energy perspective. And so you see the purple there, that's the additional layer in there that begins in 2020 and continues through the study period. And then the last portfolio we created as a sample was had a maximum constraint of 40% renewables relative to retail sales. And it's a little bit more of a moderated inclusion of renewables. So if you think to this year will be about approximately 15-16% of retail sales. Vice President Easterlin talked about next year how that's a small climb to go, or another noticeable climb to go to about 25%. And then here would be a stop at 40% instead of going all the way to 50%. We wanted to understand what that looked like. So 2017, the last recommendation for 46 megawatts of demand-side management be evaluated, and then you only have in 2018 a recommendation of 160 megawatts of wind. The portfolio has an assumed net present value cost of $5.4 billion, and again, still decreasing emissions significantly. Here's what that looks like linearly over the study period. You can see the 5 years there in between the vertical black lines, and then through the end of the study period. So now that we've gotten through kind of a detailed look at each of the 4 portfolios, we'd like to show you kind of the risk perspective of each of those portfolios. And the tool that we use to do that is a stochastics analysis. So what the stochastics analysis will do is it sort of will tell us the cost-risk trade-off that a lot of us are used to. And what happens is the model inputs that we talked about, be it fuel prices, load, technology cost, we take those and we intentionally make them volatile, and we make them move, and we want to understand what consequence that has. And the conclusion of the stochastic analysis is a distribution of potential outcomes. And so here's the drivers that I talked about kind of in the middle of the slide on the far left. So we take those inputs and we intentionally introduce volatility to them. And then the result is an updated power price. It affects the way that units are dispatched within the model, how wind penetrates within our footprint, and obviously the total portfolio cost. Another item that's noteworthy here is for each of the 4 portfolios, blue, yellow, orange, and pink, we have done 200 different scenarios for each of those 4 portfolios. So we feel like we've got a reasonable amount of potential outcomes associated with each of those portfolios to review. So here's a brief image of what that looks like graphically. You can see the gas prices in the top left and the coal prices in the bottom left. And what we're doing is we're just increasing them and decreasing them. And we're trying to derive what kind of power prices that results in within the model, and then how that affects our overall portfolio cost. Here's a very similar graph as it relates to load. So you can see the peak is about 12.5 million megawatt hours of load, and the trough there is slightly over 8, maybe to close to 9. So even if you varied load, what would that look like? Here's a slide that you probably recall from the Fort Calhoun analysis, and I'll just explain the axes real quick briefly, and then we'll talk about where those what those dots mean. So on the bottom is the mean net present value of all the portfolios. So when we go through the 200 different simulations, we're telling the model, hey, can you give me the mean of the net present value, which would obviously just be the average of all 200. And then on the left, we're trying to get an indication of risk. And so the conditional value at risk, which is CVAR 90, basically what it does is for our 200 portfolios that we ran, or 200 iterations of the same portfolio that we ran, it excludes 180 of those portfolios, which is 90%. It excludes the cheapest of those portfolios, and it says, tell me the 20 most expensive portfolios and tell me the mean of those portfolios. So worst case perspective from a cost perspective, tell me the average of that worst case. So in the top right was the baseline scenario, and then the impact of ceasing operations at Fort Calhoun in June. You can see that mean net present value move considerably to the left, and you can see the CVAR 90 indication drop considerably. And so as you move to the bottom left corner of the graph, that's essentially an optimization from a cost perspective as well as a risk perspective. So keeping those two portfolios in baseline and rebalanced, we wanted to plot where the additional 4 portfolios that we sampled would lie. So you see there right below rebalanced, a pink portfolio at 40% renewable. So you get a little bit of reduction of cost and a little bit of reduction of risk. Orange is a comparable jump. You move down and left a little bit more, and then blue and yellow is sort of the lowest cost, lowest risk portfolios according to these indicators. So now that we've looked at the 4 portfolios and the risk that's associated with each of those 4 portfolios, let's look at the attributes comparatively across all 4. So this graph is an energy sources summary, which is based on 2025 generation, which is sort of a midpoint that we identified in the study period. Blue and yellow look very, very close. Again, the only difference is an incremental battery. The orange portfolio includes the 100 megawatts of utility grade solar, and you see that represented at the top of that stack in purple. And then in pink, where you only go to 40% renewables, you see a larger concentration of coal and a smaller concentration of renewables relative to the other portfolios. And again, this is expressed as a percent of total generation. Here's an analysis or a summary slide on the demand side management program. So all 4 scenarios or all 4 portfolios identified that 46 megawatts that we should take another look at. So you can see the black line at the top. That's the 300 megawatt program, and then you can see the 254 that we did not have an uneconomic issue with, and the 46 that we did. Ideally, the discussion was to replace the 46 megawatts with another program that was more economic, and so that's kind of how we left that for the time being. And then, if you're curious on what is the overall status of the 300 megawatt program, I've included a note at the bottom that 12 megawatts of energy efficiency are implemented, and 110 megawatts of demand response out of the total 300 megawatt program have been implemented. So here's a financial summary. Portfolios on the left, some of their key attributes in the second column, and then we've compared the total cost of each portfolio as we looked at the portfolio details, and then comparatively the incremental cost. So I'm going to talk about the far right column, but when you move from yellow to blue, you see a small increase of 16.9 million. When you move from blue to orange, you see an increase of $199 million over the 20-year period, and then as you move from blue to pink, you see an increase of $280 million over the 20-year period. Emissions summary, very, very comparable. We saw that in all the portfolio detail slide, but I wanted to include a slide for those as we summarize the emissions attribute. Like I mentioned earlier, we do have intentions of a stakeholder outreach. We've been working hand in hand with our CorpCom group, and we think we've got a good plan going forward. That process would essentially start today in November, and then continue through December. There'll be information releases on social media, and then we'll be reaching out to our governmental affairs groups as well as economic development stakeholders. And then information, all this content is, if it's not already, it will be shortly posted on OPPD Listens, and I believe there'll also be a link from The Wire. The nice thing about OPPD Listens is that's actually a comment mechanism. So if you haven't been out there, that's a great way to get us your comments. And then if you don't want to do that electronically, we'll also be out at the outreach at the open houses. So we plan to do 3 of those. We'll do one at UNO here in the Metro, and then we'll do one at Blair and one down in Syracuse. So this will be available online, but real quick, here's a more detailed look at kind of the schedule. I'll just point out a couple things here. November 29th, November 30th, and December 1st. Those are the in-person open houses. And then every week you see starting on November 21st and then November 28th. And then as you go down through the list, there'll be a weekly feedback report that's provided to the board. Our friends at CorpCom will do that, and I know they'll do that well. So we intend to do that. But that's the total schedule. And then ideally, we would bring back the results from the stakeholder process and report back out in December. So there's a few next steps that we'll keep working on. So like I mentioned, the stakeholder feedback. We'll also spend some time evaluating the pursuit of common resources across the portfolio. So we'll continue our work there. We'll aggregate the feedback and bring that back to you in December based on what we've heard. The intention is to file with WAPA in early 2017. And then this process will not stop. It may not be a full-blown IRP, but as far as generation reviews, we intend to continue this process into the future.
And Brad, let me just expand on that second bullet here. So I think what we want to say in this is that as we see the common elements in each of those portfolios, and based on maybe some feedback or perspective that we get in the stakeholder process, that we may come back as early as December with some actions that we would ask the board to pursue. If in this example, it may be wind or any of the other renewables to really maximize our opportunity to capture the PTC in negotiations.
Yeah.
So it could be as early as December, just to be very clear about that, and that's what we'll evaluate over the next 30 days.
Yeah, I
and
think
come
that's a
back to
good
the board.
idea, because you don't know if the PTC is gonna be there next year.
All indications would say, I don't think though, at least what we're hearing in my meeting yesterday, is that there probably will not be an extension beyond the end date over the next 4 years after 16. But at least the scuttlebutt that we're hearing is that there's no intent to take that back to zero in 17. They'll let that law run its way through over the next 4 years and cascade down 20% a year till it gets to nothing. But as we begin to think about this, we certainly may want to take advantage of it earlier than later and understand what those impacts are. So that could potentially happen. We won't know that until we work through the process. But I wanted to be clear about what that may look like or potentially look like in December.
You know, Brad, can you discuss the battery storage and what your thought process behind that
Yeah.
was? I would think that'd be a peaking type unit, but
Yeah.
you don't have it in the baseline, but but it's the same thing except you've got the peaking, and I'm wondering, is that instead of using peaking someplace else?
Yeah, no, well, that's a great question. Thank you, Director McGuire. So the original intent was as our portfolio grows in renewables, there's a sort of a conclusion that we may make that, hey, batteries will become more relevant as renewables grow. In addition to that, you have the declining cost curve of batteries. So what started up here is now at some point here, and essentially it'll go down to here. And so we're not quite at the point where the model selected it as economic, and that's why we saw a small increase in the total net present value cost. But we thought it could potentially be beneficial, depending upon stakeholder feedback, to understand batteries, actually incorporate it into the system, understand how they operate, understand how we could use them both in from deploying the battery in a peak load perspective where prices are high, and then charging or energizing the battery when prices are low.
And I have one other question. In the future, I see us utilizing people, the consumers, the customers, using more and more of their own distributed generation. Did you put any of that into your stochastics?
We did not include DG in our modeling efforts. We're certainly aware of distributed generation. We are in the process of trying to understand that better from a quantitative basis. So where is the right data? How do we use that data? And then what does it look like in context of our portfolio? And that would be something we would continue
That's a continuing
into the
thing to look
future.
at. Yeah.
And I would just say we have a strategic initiative team that's developing kind of what that strategy looks like from an integrated marketplace perspective. And part of that would be to incorporate not only what we believe that future looks like from that kind of distributed piece, but also what OPPD's role would be
Correct.
in that piece. And so, that team, is just being organized now, we'll kind of kick off, and obviously we'll share some of the broad scope of what each of these strategic initiatives teams do. Our plan is to do that next month in the committee meetings, just to give you an idea on kind of, here's the direction of some of the initiatives that we're looking at. And that will come back to the board and report on as progress develops around that.
Thank you.
Your modeling is it looks out 20 years, and a strategic part of that is natural gas. Now, do you take into account increases and decreases in the process?
Yeah.
And then understanding this is a snapshot in time, right? And this is what we may think today, and it may change dramatically based on Clean Power Plan, based on all kinds of, am I right?
Yes, sir. Yeah,
Okay.
that's a wonderful question. You're absolutely right. So one of the ways that we try and account for the volatility of gas pricing is in that stochastics piece. So one of the inputs that we have is the price of natural gas, and when we input it at varying levels, and so that we understand what happens if natural gas prices rise, materially, or what happens if they decrease materially, and then that is reported back to us within those 200 iterations of each portfolio. Yeah.
Okay, well done.
Yep.
That's a good thing about
But
it.
it's amazing just the change that has occurred from 2014 to the prices that we received
Yeah.
the beginning, first quarter, second quarter of 2016 even, and what we went back out in the market. And what we're getting from the folks that supply the RFPs is, we want you to come back out because we think prices may even be lower than what we've sent you. So this is a competitive market really driving some opportunity for us. And that's the reason why you see that risk portfolio change from where we saw the rebalance portfolio as it's moved down. We've seen lower prices and lower risk elements around those. So that's the changes. So the snapshot is important because we know it's going to change, right? So we don't want people to get hung up and say that's what we're going to do for the next 20 years, because I don't know what other new technologies or other distributed technologies or how we'll incorporate those and integrate those in the marketplace, what that's going to look like 5, 10, or 15 years from now. And that's part of our strategic initiative. We're going to try to work through and understand what that looks like for us.
Any other questions I can answer?
Questions?
Outstanding.
Thank you.
Thank you.